Okay, welcome to episode 2 of In Defense of the Revolution, a podcast about Cuba and Cuba's solidarity from what I like to call the esophagus of the beast, just north of the belly of the beast in Canada. Well, my name is Robert Crooks. I'm here with Samantha Hislop and Cam Scott. So Cam just returned from Cuba, where he was at a conference, and he's going to speak a little bit about that. So can you give us a little bit of background and what your experience was like at this conference, Cam?
Yeah, certainly. I just came back from Havana, where I was at the 6th International Conference for World Balance, involving a lot of different participants and levels of participants, 623 delegates from 98 countries, if my notes are to be trusted. And that's not including Cubans, obviously in attendance and amply represented at every moment of the proceedings. I think before the forum, there was a process where Cubans met and discussed the affairs of every province, and a lot of professors and artists and activists and so on were represented. So that's another 400 odd people there. It was a very robustly attended conference presented by a wide range of sponsors: UNESCO, Progressive International, ECAP, the Ministry of Culture, in conjunction with the birthday anniversary of Jose Marti, and really centered on the promotion of the thought and the teaching of Jose Marti as an example of internationalism and of Cuba's style of internationalism to the world. So that was really fascinating.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. So it was put on by like the Jose Marti Institute or something, or what was it put on by?
Yeah, and one of the most fascinating sort of subplots of the conference too, there was a room that was entirely given over to poetry that was hosted by the Havana's International Poetry Festival, and gathered all kinds of poets and artists from various locales to exchange their work and talk about the promotion of literacy and the arts. So Marti was present really throughout the conference as a political philosopher and a kind of apostle of national liberation, but also it was very much grounded in his creative life and the spirit of his poetry as well. There was a beautiful event right at the base of the Jose Marti monument, with all kinds of artists reading from his poetry, performing songs. Silvio Rodriguez, really an incredible lineup. There was a big parade the day prior through Havana to celebrate Marti, who was born in 1853. So it was a really rousing occasion, as well as several days of fascinating political discussion.
So, like, what were some of the sessions or workshops that you participated in? Like, what were they about? What kind of stuff were you doing?
It was quite varied. I would say that, as we discussed, the Jose Marti Project for International Solidarity was the presenting organization, shall we say, but it was coordinated by Hector Pardo. And the opening was absolutely fascinating. It included all kinds of solidarity greetings from organizations around the world. And I think one thing that I found very, very moving, that I think speaks to the quality of participation in the Cuban Revolution, was the equivalent space that was afforded independent political organizations and grassroots groups and NGOs, and also various socialist and workers' parties and governments with whom Cuba maintains diplomatic relations. You could feel the differences in style and emphasis between these speakers, some of whom have more or less parliamentary influence. There was a delegation from Laos, for example. and also a very fiery speaker from the Workers' Party of Belgium and World Beyond War and Code Pink and so on. It was a very, very robust, respectful mix of all kinds of speakers. And you can feel the differences in emphasis and some of the fractures within a global anti-imperialist movement, but it was an incredible opening day. I was really moved by the amount, and this is a really interesting thing that we could talk about too in terms of the political and social cultures of the Cuban Revolution, the centrality of religious participation. There were greetings from the Greek Orthodox Church. Soka Gakkai, I think, is a Buddhist sect that Cuba's recognized since 2007. There was a message from Pope Francis emphasizing the plight of migrants and the displaced in the present global climate.
I mean, that's interesting, right? Because I guess the Pope played a role in negotiating Biden taking Cuba off the SSOT list, right? So it's an interesting ongoing relationship. I think it's like a bit of it's not without contradictions, but it's a very interesting relationship.
My interest seized upon that too, because a lot of the press coverage of Biden's removal of Cuba from the state sponsors of terrorism list emphasized the role of the church as it concerned the release of opposition activists from prison, I believe, right? And I presumed, and we spoke about this a little, that Biden more or less had to perform as if something had substantially changed in that last week, such that he hadn't been stalling for years. But the Cuban government's own language and the Pope's greeting to the conference, they used some of the same constructions. Both spoke of a jubilee year in which to forgive and so on. So it's a really interesting moment of accord. The day's keynote was delivered by Frei Beto, a Brazilian theologian, but he was the co-author of Fidel and Religion, which is a very influential book in the reappraisal of different Christian socialist currents and summarizes Castro's changing views on religion in Cuban society. And he was the primary speaker, and he spoke at great length and with a lot of power about, quote, systematic work for the promotion of Martí's ideas and the importance of Martí to the entire world, not just the Cuban Revolution. So he was a very powerful speaker, but again, the opening ceremony was very religious in tenor. It was interesting. Yeah,
that is interesting. So I think during that conference, Trump announced that he would be sending migrants being deported from the United States to Guantanamo Bay. If I'm not mistaken, I think that announcement happened during or maybe just before the conference. I'm wondering if that played any role at the conference.
Absolutely. It was the very first day of the conference, I believe, on January 28th, right? So more or less during the opening ceremonies, people are looking at their phones and so on, and Trump announces his intent to turn Guantanamo Bay into a migrant detention center. I mean, we shouldn't mince words, a concentration camp for 30,000 persons. So this harkens back to previous uses of Guantanamo to detain very many Haitians and so on. It's nothing new, but his re-engagement with the facility. I mean, it's a gross violation of Cuban sovereignty, and here we are sitting discussing the vision of Martí, the gift of sovereignty and independence associated with Martí. It was a really horrifying contrast, the presence of Guantanamo in Cuba is a scandal.
Definitely.
And also something that I've seen concern expressed for as well. And this also goes for the new deal that the United States made with El Salvador just a few days ago, that they would be, sending, and it could include U.S. citizens as well, criminals, outsourcing the prison facilities or using El Salvador's prison facilities to house criminals, whether it be migrants or U.S. citizens. But my understanding is that whether it's Guantanamo Bay prison facility or torture facility, concentration camp, whatever you want to call it, or a prison in another country such as El Salvador, US law doesn't apply there. I'm not 100% sure about Guantanamo because I think they consider that US soil because it's a military base, but I could be wrong because they broke all of their own laws there anyways, let alone international law. Same with El Salvador. Like, it's really scary what could happen to these people. They're just being so belligerent now. And yeah, it's really concerning. It's a huge violation. Yeah, not just of Cuba's sovereignty in the case of Guantanamo prison, but of migrant rights, human rights. It's a gross violation.
Yeah, and it's a really terrifying trend in the Trump administration to sort of shore up as much control over the Western Hemisphere as possible. I just wanted to go over some of the history of Guantanamo Bay, if that's okay. So basically, the United States began occupying Guantanamo Bay, an area of 117.6 square kilometers, during the Cuban National Liberation War against Spain, when the U.S. got involved after the mysterious explosion of the USS Maine, which allowed them to enter into the war, which is known in this part of the world as the Spanish-American War. In 1903, there was an agreement, so-called, between the United States and Cuba for lease of the lands at Guantanamo Bay in accordance with the 7th article of the Platt Amendment. The Platt Amendment, that specific article saying that to enable the United States to maintain the independence of Cuba and to protect the people thereof, as well as for its own defense, the government of Cuba will sell or lease to the United States lands necessary for coaling or naval stations at certain specified points to be agreed upon with the President of the United States. So a pretty imposing U.S. law, basically telling Cuba what to do with its own land. The Platt Amendments, named after Orville Platt, who was a senator from Connecticut, and it's called the amendment because it was an amendment to the Army Appropriations Act, which came out of the Treaty of Paris, which is, I guess, what legally ended the so-called Spanish-American War, where Spain, legally gave its colonies away to the United States. But of course, there was opposition in Cuba and even in the Cuban government to this, led by Juan Gilberto Gomez, for example. But it's really amazing when, how the U.S., if you actually read what the U.S. says, both publicly and not publicly, of course, we have memos and stuff that come out after. And actually, there is records of Platt saying behind closed doors that the purpose of this was basically to take over Cuba so that it can be a vacation spot for people from the U.S. and so they could control the sugar. They wanted to take over the sugar production at the time. But this currently, I'm just going to read this paragraph because it's amazing, the hubris of the United States government. This is on the State Department's website right now. It says, the Platt Amendment's conditions prohibited the Cuban government from entering into any international treaty that would compromise Cuban independence or allow foreign powers to use the island for military purposes. I mean, it's kind of difficult to wrap your head around that because it's, on the one hand, saying that it's the purpose is to protect Cuban independence and ensure that the Cuban island isn't used for military purposes, while the U.S. is violating both these things. It's taking over Cuban independence and it's using their land for military purposes. It goes on to say the United States also reserved the right to intervene in Cuban affairs in order to defend Cuban independence and to maintain a government adequate for the protection of life, property, and individual liberty. So basically saying if Cuba gets a government that the U.S. doesn't like, specifically like a socialist government, then the U.S. has the legal right to intervene. Yeah, so the Guantanamo Bay was mostly used for refueling U.S. ships and also was tied to the U.S.'s desire or covetousness over the Panama Canal. It's interesting how history repeats, but back then in the early 20th century, the U.S. was looking at the Panama Canal already. I guess at this time, I'm not sure if the Panama Canal was completed, but it had been started by the French, and then they abandoned it, and then the U.S. Made a move to take it over. The Platt Amendment was annulled in 1934. Then a new agreement was signed by the Roosevelt administration and the Cuban government, in this case including Fulgencio Batista, of course the dictator that the July 26 movement would end up overthrowing. And then the U.S. officially established a naval military base there and began sucking up a lot of resources from the Cuban island. For example, they were redirecting a lot of water to the base. And they started stationing troops there during World War II and then during the Korean War. And there's these stories of like the U.S. attacking Cuba and antagonizing Cubans from this base for decades, like, even going so far as dropping incendiary devices from planes, shooting at Cuban people from the base. There's lots of stories of like U.S. soldiers torturing and killing Cubans, like either Cubans who were staff at Guantanamo Bay, who they would accuse of being spies, and then they would just torture to death. Or it just sounds like, in some cases, it was just drunk U.S. soldiers going out and killing a Cuban because they fucking could, Technically, the U.S. has been renting Guantanamo Bay. They've been paying the Cuban government, but since the revolution in 1959, the Cuban government has not accepted the money because they do not want the U.S. occupying that land. It's quite interesting that I think now like the amount they pay is like $4,000 a month for the use of Guantanamo Bay, which is like you could like rent a whole house for that in most cities.
Less than what it would cost to rent a house in Toronto.
Yeah, exactly, right.
I think it's annual, and it's only doubled once since 1903.
I don't know what happens to that money, if it just stays in limbo, or because like the Cuban government doesn't accept it.
My understanding is that there's a, I believe Fidel spoke about having a drawer full of them,
like checks.
Yeah, they could wallpaper the room with these uncashed checks, and the interesting thing is he'll admit that only one of them was ever cashed in a moment of, I believe, sort of transitional uncertainty or confusion.
Yeah, it was like a mistake, I think. It was like an administrative error. Yeah. They're like, wait, no, we're not accepting this. Oops.
Into the shredder.
I saw an article the other, a couple of days ago. It was Western media. I don't know if it was like Reuters or something, Associated Press, whatever. And they just when they were talking about, that they're going to be sending migrants to Guantanamo prison, there was just a tiny little blurb about the fact that the way they worded it was just it was like Cuba has been reluctant to accept payments from the, instead of definitively saying Cuba has not they completely reject this occupation. Of course they wouldn't say that. It's just, they're reluctant to accept payment. It's been a bone of contention between the United States and Cuba.
So I mean, it's a ridiculous relationship. It's notably, I think it's the only place in Cuba you can get McDonald's. So there's that.
It's like the Tim Hortons in Kandahar.
Yeah, exactly. So the U.S. used Guantanamo Bay, and Cam referenced this earlier, to invade Haiti, and then they kept 45,000 Haitians there at the base. That same year, I believe, they also turned it into a concentration camp for Cubans who were trying to reach the United States. And of course, this is 1994. This is the special period. This is after the collapse of the USSR, after basically the collapse of Cuba's external trade relations. So it was a very dire time in Cuba. So people were trying to reach the United States, and the U.S. was picking them up and putting them in a detention camp in Guantanamo Bay. In 1996, Clinton signed a deal that said the only way the U.S. would leave Guantanamo Bay was if there was a, quote, free and elected government in Cuba, which, of course, we know this is BS. The people of Cuba support the government. There are elections in Cuba. But just to throw it back in the U.S.'s face, the Cuban government went and re-ratified publicly their constitution just to show Clinton and everyone in the U.S., this is a free government. This is the government of the people. And then, of course, in 2002 is when the U.S. opened their prison for the, quote, war on terror, where countless human rights abuses have occurred. They haven't allowed in inspectors. So just, it's kind of difficult to even imagine the horrors that have gone on there. Just one last thing I just wanted to quote Diaz-Canel, who responded to this announcement by Trump that he would be sending migrants there. Diaz-Canel said, "In an act of brutality, the new U.S. government announces the imprisonment at the Guantanamo Naval Base, located in illegally occupied Cuban territory, of thousands of migrants that it is forcibly expelling, who will be placed next to the well-known prisons of torture and illegal detention." So it's very clear that the Cuban government, the Cuban people, consider this an illegal occupation. They do not want the U.S. there. And basically, the U.S. still uses this naval base to spy on Cubans, to threaten Cuba, to antagonize Cuba into war, so that they can justify overthrowing the government there. So it's not just a banal occupation of this land where U.S. soldiers are hanging out and playing cards. It's a very strategic and dangerous occupation for the Cuban government and the Cuban people.
I was incredibly moved by Diaz-Canel's closing remarks at this conference, and he spoke directly, to fairly thunderous applause of the threat to send an additional 30,000 deportees to Guantanamo, and really reiterated this theme of balance, of world balance with respect to that, and said that Guantanamo is an emblem really of the notion that there are superior peoples and countries in the world. For this reason, it was a thread throughout so many other panels. I was in a panel that was convened by ECAP. There were so many solidarity greetings from organizations around the world that made mention of this. That same afternoon, there was an ECAP panel, The Defense of Peace and Just Causes, and this was very good. This was with the president of ECAP, Fernando Gonzalez, who of course is one of the Cuban Five, a true hero, as well as Jamu Baraka from the Black Alliance for Peace, and Bamin Azad. It was a very good panel, but the consistent refrain throughout this was of the need for the U.S. to close really all of its bases on all foreign territories, not just Guantanamo. And Guantanamo was the most proximate example and the most pressing example because of the geography upon which this conference transpires and because of Trump's escalation. But the really, really pressing demands issuing from the floor, almost speaker by speaker, were for the withdrawal of the U.S. from all of the territories that its bases occupy, and there are, of course, hundreds.
Cuba's not alone, that's for sure. People stand with the people of Cuba, and what is the U.S. has over 800 bases across the world. Well,
and one of the most fascinating demonstrations of that solidarity was from Venezuela, who sent many delegations, all of whom stressed the common fate of Cuba and Venezuela, where Venezuela had once helped Cuba through shortages of gasoline and so on. The situation now is such that a lot of Venezuelan speakers were drawing a strict analogy between the country's recent experiences confronting sanctions and U.S. meddling and so on. I believe that the first prisoners have already been sent to Guantanamo, and those 10 people were Venezuelans who were allegedly from a street gang, which apparently poses some risk to international security. This doesn't really make any sense, but you can see how an apparatus like the prison at Guantanamo actually conjoins the fate of the peoples of the Americas before U.S. empire and its designs.
al usar ese territorio ilegalmente ocupado por más de un siglo como base militar y prisión, donde se tortura y se encierra en un limbo legal a personas que el imperio declara enemigas y culpables, la mayoría de las veces sin una sola evidencia de su crimen.
Now, this common fate is not decided by empire alone, but is the result of hemispheric collaboration and friendship. There was a great deal of optimism throughout the conference of BRICS, because everywhere in Cuba, of course, you can feel the strain and the effects of the illegal U.S. blockade. At this point, with Trump in office, Rubio was rolling out all kinds of further escalations day by day throughout the conference. You really get the sense the blockade is not to be lifted, and so much depends upon membership in BRICS, which Cuba joined only as of January 1st, I think.
Yeah, I believe they attended the conference in Kaza in Russia in October. They were invited to attend and to become partner members. I guess that decision has to be made, which partner countries get accepted. The BRICS member countries, like Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, the large economies, the emerging economies, they're kind of like the members. And so they would have consulted after the conference and decided who's accepted as a partner. And Cuba was accepted as a BRICS partner, and that took effect on January 1st. Okay. And absolutely, this is a really positive development, a really necessary development, because, I mean, the current financial system as it's been up to this point internationally is completely unjust and exclusive, and that's the reason why the United States has been able to impose its will on all of these less developed, less powerful countries with smaller economies and not strong militaries, is because of their control of the international financial system. The SWIFT system is the messaging system, right, that all of the international institutions use to communicate and send their transactions. It's the way that money moves through the world. So this SWIFT system, the United States, I forget which department it is. I don't know if it's OFAC, but anyways, they have like full visibility into this system. And I think they were granted that sometime after 9/11, like under the guise of, we need this access to see, to stop terrorism and financing terrorism, right?
Yeah.
So they can see everything, and transactions that have nothing to do with the United States at all can be intercepted. Funds can be seized by the United States. Those are called U-turn transactions. So it originates in like one country outside of the United States, and it ends up supposed to end up in another country outside of the United States, but it has to like route through that system, which the U.S. has visibility and ultimately control over. Something needed to be done about this. It's not obviously Cuba has been like the longest sanctioned country. Apparently about a third of the world's countries are under some kind of economic sanctions by the United States. Nothing has come close to what Cuba has gone to, like not even close. But the global South, the working people across the globe they're just fed up. There needed to be an alternative. BRICS, it's an organization, it's an alliance or an association of countries, but they have their new development bank, which is kind of, most people would say that the equivalent, the pre-existing equivalent to the new development bank is the IMF. And if anybody knows anything about the IMF, it's totally destroyed so many parts of the world. It's de-developed countries. It's basically just been a tool, the IMF, of the United States and its multinational corporations to get access to resources and labor in these countries. And basically, any country that took a loan from the IMF, the terms are totally unfair and unjust. huge interest rates that a small country or a developing country would have no chance of ever being able to pay off. So the initial terms are like usually like for a loan or for investment from the IMF, it's like really high interest rate. And sometimes initially too, there's some aspect of privatization that has to be done or access to Western multinationals. But when the time comes where this country like clearly is not going to be able to pay back the debt and they go to restructure, then they really go in and they like impose all this privatization, all this austerity. The IMF has not helped. There's not even a single case where any country is doing better, I don't think, after taking IMF loans. And this is for countries that are not sanctioned. They're not sanctioned. A big part of it too is because the USD has been the reserve currency. So most countries have to settle their payments in USD, even if like, again, two countries that are not the United States, but they have to transact in US dollars kind of thing. So that's a great thing about BRICS, is that it's implementing like a broad-based currency mechanism. Like local currencies will be used. Countries can settle in their own currencies. And it's much more inclusive. It's a much more inclusive financial architecture, and it will bring a lot of opportunities. It's an alternative to the IMF. Cuba actually, I think they left the IMF shortly after the revolution. So they didn't have access to any of that anyway. Not that I think they would have wanted it, because they're truly a sovereign country, and they wouldn't have done that to themselves. But aside from not being able to access, quote unquote, investment or help or loans from the IMF, because of the sanctions, Cuba has had a hard time getting any kind of loans via any other mechanism or through other countries. Like, most people don't understand the extent to which the international financial architecture up until now, which has been dominated by the United States, a lot of people don't really appreciate how much that has hindered Cuba and its development. And that's why you see that they've had so much difficulty in upgrading their infrastructure, specifically, and most relevant right now would be their electrical grid. Never mind having the money or being able to get loans to build new plants with newer technology or alternative technology. They have a hard time even getting replacement parts and maintaining those plants because of sanctions. So this is an amazing development for Cuba. It's so funny. I was reading an article from the Miami Herald that was written, I think about a week before this BRICS conference in Kazan last October when Cuba attended. So it was about a week before, and the article was basically saying, there's no way Cuba is going to get accepted as a partner. They have nothing, they truly don't. It was written by this one journalist. She's always hating on Cuba. She's totally anti-Cuba. Nora Gomez Torres or something. So their whole perspective just shows you the way that they think, though, like this imperialistic mindset, and this, like, Cuba has nothing to offer. If they think that they're going to show up at this BRICS conference and say, we're here bringing our solidarity, everybody's just going to roll their eyes. Nobody's there for solidarity. They're there for money. It's just another way for them to rattle the Salvation Army bell. Like, it was just really horrible. As if Cuba has nothing to offer, and as if they haven't been offering anything to the rest of the world for decades. So just the perspective itself was kind of funny, because their only way of viewing the world is that, like, everything is predatory. So Cuba has nothing to offer. Like, they don't belong in this club. People want to make money. That's it, no matter at whose expense, kind of thing. It didn't age well, basically, because they were accepted as a partner. They are a BRICS partner now. So I thought that was funny reading that in the Miami Herald. Yeah.
Reading the Miami Herald is a trip. Sometimes I wonder, like, do they actually believe like what they're writing, or are they just trying to like throw as much dirt on Cuba as they possibly can? You know,
I don't think there's any way. At least half of this stuff they can't believe. There's no way. I don't know. Maybe they do.
Well, and if you read a lot of the anti-Cuban rhetoric issuing from that sort of a perspective, it's funny because there's this kind of kettle logic too, where I've seen similar reporting. They'll say, "Oh, Cuba doesn't contribute any value to this," right? And then on the other hand, if they have to give an account of Cuba's obvious medical internationalism or its incredible outreach as regards global literacy. You can't speak about Ebola. You cannot speak about so many global public health disasters without speaking about Cuban medical internationalism. They'll say that Cuba's involvement in all of these countries is a cynical attempt to curry favor, and that they are trying to sell their political system by way of foreign aid. So either they're wheeling and dealing by way of these relationships, or they don't have anything to contribute to the world, but it couldn't possibly be both, right?
Yeah, it's so interesting you bring up their like medical internationalism, and it's so true, because like they're like medical, like obviously like their hospitals and their healthcare are very advanced. They're very like underfunded because of the blockade. But they're, I'd rather be sick in Cuba than I would be in Canada, to be quite honest. But then they're also developing these treatments that are some of the most advanced in the world, like their treatments for lung cancer, their treatment for Alzheimer's, their treatment for diabetes, and these are like medicines that people in the U.S. could benefit from, but can't get direct access to because of the blockade and because of the demonization of Cuba. So yeah, it is really so cynical for these people to make it seem like Cuba has nothing to offer. Like if Cuba has nothing to offer, if there's such like a country that has nothing, then why are they trying to crush it so badly? Like it's just so seeped in contradiction and ridiculousness. So I guess I'm wondering about the BRICS though. It's like this is a very good development, but I guess it's not totally clear to me what will be the immediate advantages for Cuba. Like obviously it's opening up some possibilities for trade, and like you were saying, I guess like the development bank, they might be able to get some like loans that could help them develop in whatever way they see fit. But I know like China, for example, has been doing a lot with Cuba in terms of like energy, like diversifying their energy. Like they've built like solar panel fields, for example, in Cuba. But at the same time, China is also very careful not to break the like the blockade or the sanctions, and not sort of cross U.S. And it's for obvious reasons. They don't want to become a target of the U.S. and they also have a lot of trade with the U.S., right? So they don't want to jeopardize that. But I guess I'm wondering, like, will Cuba's admission into BRICS somehow help to divert or circumvent, I guess, the blockade, and like how will that work?
I mean, I'm no expert, but one way that I understand that it will work or should work is just the way that the transactions are facilitated in the first place. So the United States won't have visibility into that, and they'll have no way to access or block transactions or seize any funds. And that also, so that's going to remove barriers from the other countries that want to work with Cuba. They're not going to be afraid, right, of retaliation by the United States, because I believe the United States won't have like total like documentation. They won't know all the details of everything that's happening. I mean, they'll know there's intelligence and they know what's, but I'm not naive. But like, it just won't be how it is with the current system. They don't have the access and the mechanisms to steal money, to steal funds from countries or corporations doing business with Cuba. And then the other thing is that BRICS and the new development bank will kind of lessen or remove like the primacy of the US dollar, which is good for all of these countries, not just for Cuba. It's good for any country, even if they're not sanctioned at all. Any underdeveloped country or countries with a weaker currency that don't want to take predatory loans from the IMF can work through BRICS now, and they will be able to settle in their own currency, potentially, the payments. Right. There's also been talk about some kind of BRICS currency. I don't know if that will come to fruition. It hasn't yet, and I don't know. Again, I'm not an expert, so, but
yeah, I know. That makes sense, right? Because like I know, like a lot of the issues with Cuba is that, yeah, like doing international trade, you have to pay in USD. And a part of the goal of the measures against Cuba by the United States is to prevent Cuba from getting USD. Yeah. So they don't have American dollars to spend on the market. Yes. And they can't I guess they can't convert because they can't access banks. I'm not exactly sure how that works. But yeah, like so that is pretty exciting, and I'm excited to see how this transpires in the next couple of years.
Me too. Yeah.
Oh, well, and I think that at present, with banking restrictions as they are, Cuba needs to pay upfront for all of its imports. So I've certainly read things that emphasize the possibility of new lines of credit in alternative currencies. Now, where these challenges to U.S. dollar hegemony are concerned, this is also obviously the backdrop to so much of Trump's language around trade war and tariffs. You know, we're sitting in Canada where we are facing down, these 25% tariffs and so on, but he's threatened 100% tariffs on the BRICS countries that adopt this this possible alternative currency, Yeah. So the stakes for the United States are very, very clear from the quality of the Trump administration's response. This challenge to dollar imperialism, I think, is a major concern of the United States.
Yeah, for sure. It's funny because I've been talking, because I'm obviously so very on top of Cuba news and things like that, and things that affect Cuba, as are you too. I've been talking to like family members about BRICS for like a couple years, and they were like, "What are you talking about?" Or they'd be like, "Well, that's not good if the US dollar, like that doesn't sound good." Like, so they were almost like against the idea and didn't understand it. And now suddenly, because Trump's throwing BRICS, the acronym around suddenly, still I would say most people in Canada and the US like don't know what it is at all. But some of my family members are like in favor of BRICS now just because Trump doesn't like it. It's just kind of funny. But they still don't really understand it all. But and he's threatened. He kind of said something like, we will put tariffs on any country who intends to join BRICS or something like that. So then you have Marco Rubio the other day admitting that the era of unipolarity is over, and that it was irrational in the first place, and that it's only normal to have he called them multiple powers. I think he did use the word multipolarity as well, but he mentioned we're moving back to a he kind of was like, polarity was, at the end of the Cold War, and that's not relevant anymore. Now we're going to return back to what's normal, and that's a multipolarity and, big powers, having influence on certain regions of the world. So I don't know what the angle was there, but to admitting that, like, I still don't really know exactly why he said that. And he knew what he was saying. And what he was saying was true. And yes, but you're admitting that the United States should not have this domination over the entire globe. So which way are you turning now? I think that in their mind, their only option now, is the Western Hemisphere and focusing, pivoting to Latin America. But that doesn't, in my opinion, I don't think, I believe they still want a conflict with China.
Well, they want to control. They want to control the trade routes specifically,
yes.
right? Like through the north. I think that's part of what Trump's, going for Greenland is, and of course the Panama Canal.
Yeah.
But that is interesting, especially considering Marco Rubio, like a year or two ago, was like freaking out about people going off the dollar and about how this gives China more power and the U.S. has to step up. So yeah, that is interesting. It's yeah. I wonder what's going on behind the closed doors there.
I don't know if he believes what he was saying when he said it, or if he's trying to maybe he's adjusting to a new narrative that they're trying to shape about, pursuing, like, the Monroe Doctrine, I guess. Like, maybe this is just their way of, like I said, pivoting, and they're just trying to sell this to their own population, maybe. Being like, actually, you know what? Yeah. And also with the pausing of the USAID or USAID funding, which I think none of us are naive, that subversive funding of, like, NGOs and journalism, that's not going to stop. It's just they're just restructuring and rebranding it. It'll probably be more covert, but it's like, I think they're just trying to, like, maybe to their own population or to the Western population, it's like, see, we're going to stop doing this. We're going to focus on, like, they're bringing it back home kind of thing. And to them, home includes what they call their backyard, which is like Latin America. And
like what, how they're talking about it, well, they ended funding to USAID. It's exactly what they did. Like, why there is a National Endowment for Democracy and why there is a USAID is because the CIA was getting a bad reputation. So they wanted to soften it. So that's probably just like, it's just a similar tactic, just updated for today.
Yeah. The outrage about USAID funding getting cut or paused, I mean, there is huge outrage, right? Some people know what it was about, and they're mad because they've lost their source of income or livelihood. But a lot of people really think that was helping. They think it, like, if you look at the percentages of the way that the billions of dollars were spent, I think more than half of it was spent on what they called governance, which is regime change and political interference. Like, down at the bottom of the list, like 15% was spent on, like, projects to create like clean water projects or something. Like, people think that's what it was all about, though, and we know
CBC's losing their mind about it right now. So,
I saw that BBC was receiving like millions annually from them. Why does the BBC even need funds in the first place? First of all, but yeah, like
I think we know why.
we know, yeah.
Well, but this is I think that this is sort of part and parcel to Rubio's reorientation too. Is it's one of the paradoxical rhetorics of the MAGA coalition's peculiar brand of U.S. isolationism or protectionism, but also a very particular policy of peace through strength and so on. They don't necessarily want to abandon the age of U.S. preponderant power. they perceive themselves as having been footing the bill for so many other countries, and now they've come around to collect, you know? And I think that when Rubio talks about multipolarity, he's partly talking about this new regime of tariffs and all kinds of competitive mechanisms. And, you know, there's the delusion you find with people who think that Trump is going to get out of NATO and so on because of his grandstanding in this respect. But really, no, he's just demanding that the rest of its membership foot the bill. And I really do think that when Rubio talks about a multipolar world and talks about U.S. unipolarity as anomalous, you know, he's mostly finding a contemporary idiom in which to describe massive withdrawal and divestment of U.S. funds from all kinds of international relationships.
Yeah, I think that's accurate. Yeah,
and I think refocusing them, right, to like Samantha said, to, you know, their backyard and in Latin America, but also this is what Canada's caught up in right now too, like with the tariff war and the 51st state stuff, and you know that they're going to be pushing to militarize the North. So I think this is all, I think Cam's right about this.
Well, and then the predicament we find ourselves in is actually only too familiar to Cubans and to many other people, right? Where we are facing down a new style of U.S. diplomacy, not a new style, rather, but a new rhetoric or a repackaging of this style of international relations that is really all about economic coercion and blockade.
And maybe in the Cuba solidarity movement here, like, we should see if we can find a way to kind of take advantage of some people in this country, in Canada, who are like you said, they're just getting a small we're just getting a small taste. It's nothing like what Cubans have gone through for decades and a couple of generations now, but like, it could be a moment for some people to start to understand imperialism, including Canada's role in imperialism, but maybe open some people's eyes. I would hope, anyways. Yeah.
And it's only been the close economic integration of Canada and the United States that has obliged Canada to the implementation of the blockade in so many respects, where, you know, if more than 10% is it of a product is manufactured in the U.S., then it's not possible for us to export it to Cuba. I think that there are possibly good outcomes in a new movement for Canadian political and economic independence that would necessarily transpire on the other side of Trump's threats.
Well, that was a good conversation.
Yeah, thanks to both of you.
Thanks, Samantha. Thanks, Cam.
Lleno de emoción y ruido, alguien dijo conmovido y feliz, gracias Fidel. Y el pueblo después de un año repite, gracias Fidel. Y el pueblo después de un año repite, gracias Fidel. Y pusieron un cartel con la frase mencionada, repitiendo alborozada y feliz, gracias Fidel. Y el pueblo después de un año repite, gracias Fidel. Y el pueblo después de un año repite, gracias Fidel. Y empezamos a tener leyes revolucionarias, la ley de reforma agraria y la ley del alquiler. Y el pueblo después de un año repite, gracias Fidel. Y el pueblo después de un año repite, gracias Fidel. Y una ley tras otra ley, leyes para los de abajo, para el hombre sin trabajo, muerto de hambre en el batey. Y el pueblo después de un año repite, gracias Fidel. Y el pueblo después de un año repite, gracias Fidel. Y como el pueblo sincero aplaudía entusiasmado, todos los psiquitrillados arrancaron el letrero. Y el pueblo después de un año repite, gracias Fidel. Y el pueblo después de un año repite, gracias Fidel. Que quitaran el cartel, eso era asunto sabido, pero el pueblo agradecido repite, gracias Fidel. Y el pueblo después de un año repite, gracias Fidel. Y el pueblo después de un año repite, gracias Fidel.